Everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Child Psychology's 2025 Spring Parenting and Children's Mental Health Summit. My name is Tammy Shimoon, and I'm a child psychologist and the co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology and also the co-host of the Child Psych podcast, which I know we're going to put this on our podcast too, so anyone listening, you're also in the right place for that. And today we have Jen Alexander with me, who is probably one of my favorite trauma-informed educators. She's a school counselor, and she wrote probably my favorite book for teachers on trauma called Building Trauma-Sensitive Schools. And any of you watching on YouTube, I'll hold it up. It's my Bible for working with teachers. And she also, which we're going to talk about, put out an online course and a workbook called Becoming a Trauma-Sensitive Educator, which I actually just finished today. So really exciting. We'll talk about that. Jen is a licensed special education teacher, professional school counselor, trauma expert, author, and a leader in the movement to build trauma-sensitive schools. She has more than 20 years experience providing support to young people and to educators who serve them. Her current role as a consultant and facilitator of professional development, Miss Jen shows educators what works and why when it comes to building trauma-sensitive learning environments. She holds a degree in psychology and special education, teaching, as well as a master's degree in professional school counseling from the University of Northern Iowa. She's a nationally certified counselor and registered school-based play therapist. When she's not writing, Zooming, or traveling to work with educators, she enjoys reading, flower garden, swimming, and spending time with loved ones and her Cocker Spaniel, Macy. We are kindred spirits. That sounds like my life. Just add my 3 kids and some horses in the mix.
Thank you, Tammy, so much for having me here. I love what you and your organization do to support educators, family members, parents, caregivers, and mental health professionals too. So it's exciting to get to talk with you today.
And anyone listening, if this is good, I mean, it's even good for parents. We'll talk about trauma and what that means and defining it. But I mean, for the current state of the world, educators and preschool workers, daycare workers, this isn't just about like school teachers. We're talking about like any education environment or child care environment where there's groups of kids and you are in charge of taking care of them. This is really what we're talking about here. And I'm telling you, I've read so many bloody books on trauma and schools. And honestly, yours is the only one that like I'll tell people to buy. It's the only one. Like specifically for schools. Again, everyone that's building trauma-sensitive schools, it's probably the most practical. And I used to be a teacher, and it's actually something I could take into my classroom and start doing things like right now. And same with your workbook. Like and it's an online course when you get the workbook, so it's awesome.
Well, thank you for that feedback. How you look at things matters to me because I understand your expertise as a professional, and that's always been important to me to make sure that anything I'm doing for and with folks is something that they can glean information, but also strategies and tools from that they can start putting into practice right away.
Yeah. And I think it's funny. I've now put this in so many of my slides is when I first read your book, which was like, I want to say 4 years ago, maybe 5. I think it was pre-COVID actually, before when you put that out. We were at a hotel room and I read it and I was the whole Tanya, I was like, we're just getting rid of the other books and recommending this one. This is now my go-to. And I still put your quote in all of my trauma courses because I teach trauma more for like parents and mental health providers versus teachers, but lots of teachers take it. But then I always tell them to take your course next. Consider what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you was like the first slide I had for teachers. Like that's a first thing you need to consider. And then Oprah went and wrote a book with Bruce Perry. And then that was like the main theme. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure Jen said that first.
Well,
Unless you got it from Bruce Perry. I was like,
I am not the first person to ever say that.
Oh, okay.
But I may be
your book though.
I may be one of the first who said it in the educational world, but I learned it from some other experts as well.
Okay. I know Bruce Perry really Oprah talk about that a lot, that same line, which is a great reframe. So for all of our, hopefully educators who really tuned into this course in particular for our summit, this masterclass, and for those listening to the podcast, I think we're all they're wandering through this being like, well, I'm not a therapist, I'm a teacher. And I think you say that very clearly, you're not supposed to be, that's not your job. You're not a therapist, but we're holding these stories of trauma in the classroom, regardless of whether they're a therapist or not. So maybe we can start really micro and talk about how you would explain trauma to teachers who are listening, to educators. And then we'll talk about kind of the nervous system, and then we'll break it down into your model for schools. Does that work?
That sounds like a great plan.
Okay.
When I think about how to talk with folks, no matter what their role may be, as someone who cares about kids, is to understand that we all experience stress. We all experience difficulties, challenges that come up in our lives, things that we feel a bit of energy that gets bigger or tension that gets bigger in response to it. And it affects not only how we feel inside, but what we may do in terms of our actions. Trauma is a type of stress, but it's one type of stress. It's overwhelming stress. It's when stress becomes so big that it overwhelms a person's capacity to cope with that in a healthy way. And it has lasting effects on not only their experience right around that event or events, but also in how they function afterwards too.
And so I know in your book, in like the original book, not the workbook, you talk a lot about ACEs. And that to me, like that when I talk to educators and I do corporate trainings, I usually break it down into ACEs because that's really easy. Now, granted, there are things that can traumatize kids outside of the family system. But ACEs is one way to understand trauma within the system. Could you talk like just touch on that a little bit about ACEs? Because that would be one way to look at it.
So the ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's based on studies that came out of work with Kaiser Permanente and researchers who were looking at, but they were beginning to look at obesity and the health effects that may come with that and what they could do about that as medical practitioners. And as part of that research, they asked over 17,000 folks to complete a questionnaire that related to their childhood experiences. And again, they were studying obesity, but then what they started to realize because of that data is that there's a big relationship between adversity in childhood and health outcomes that may be related to obesity, but many other things too. And there's other research that really supports the importance of understanding traumas and its effects as well. But ACEs is one that many folks have heard of. And so you're right that it encapsulates several different types of adversity, but there are also types of adversity and traumas that aren't included in those studies. Like the original ones didn't include racism or other harms that may happen to an entire group of folks and are
Like
related to
COVID-19,
yeah,
COVID,
yeah.
political divide between countries, within the country, all the stress that comes with that. Yeah. School
Absolutely.
lockdowns, things like that. Yeah.
Yes. And when you mention school lockdowns, I think that brings us to another topic too, that often when we start to think about trauma, especially when I work with educators, is we think about trauma that happens outside of school. But it's so important to recognize that even if it's not on the ACE questionnaire, there is trauma that happens at school. And that's important for us to learn about, understand, and then take action to stop. Because when we're working with people who work in a school, that's where we have the power to change that. But of course, community members, family caregivers, and other stakeholders play a role in that too.
Yeah. So what are our ACEs? We've got divorce and separation, parental neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. What else we
Physical
got?
abuse,
Yeah. Parental incarceration.
incarceration,
Yeah.
mental health conditions that may be affecting a
Right.
caregiver. There's several more, but again,
I
there's
know.
so
I'm like,
many traumas that aren't even on that list too.
everybody Google ACEs. There's actually quizzes you can take online to like, what's my ACE score? Because the higher ACEs you have, the more likely you're to have negative health outcomes, which is why trauma is not just a mental health issue. It's like it's a health epidemic that we're seeing globally.
Absolutely. But one thing to keep in mind if folks are going to take that questionnaire is that the results are based on group effects. So when we have a large group of folks who take that questionnaire, there are trends that start to happen. The more instances of adversity they have in their childhoods, the more likely they are to have negative health effects. But it doesn't mean each individual will. So if you take that questionnaire and your ACE score is high, it doesn't automatically mean you will have those health effects, because the other piece that's missing in that research is what are the protective factors that
Mm.
help people go through big stress and not end up with those negative outcomes. And
Yeah,
of course, there are a lot of people who have some negative outcomes, but positive ones too, because post-traumatic growth is also a very real phenomenon.
that's my third question we're going to talk about. So we're going to come back. We'll circle back to post-traumatic growth because that's really, really important, I think, to address. I know, so no one panics if they take the ACE score. My ACE score is 6 or 7. And I'm like, so far I'm doing pretty good. So you can have a high ACE score and not have, diabetes or heart attacks or all of these things that can suicide and all these things that tend to be related. So, I mean, there are, but again, protective factors that they don't talk about. And that's resilience research, right? What makes kids resilient? And just
Right,
because you
and
have
it's why the
trauma
work
doesn't
that we
mean that
do is so important because we believe and know from the
it's
research that when we intervene and we build community and relationships where people can be supported and experience safety day in and day out, whether that's outside of school in our homes or inside of school or other community settings, that makes a difference in helping people recover from all the stresses that all of us experience.
Yeah. So I know one thing of talking to teachers a lot. And again, we're really clear here that teachers aren't therapists. You're not doing, we're not doing EMDR with kids. We're not doing desensitization work. But to be clear, you're holding the stories that are unfolding because kids do these reenactments in the classroom. So when it comes to the traumatized student, I always tell teachers their job isn't to be an investigator. That's not what we're doing. Of course, if we know of something, we can report it. We're mandated reporters. But then what does if parents are just like, educators just want to know, like, how do I identify if a child has trauma? I'm trying to be more sensitive. Could you talk about the different faces of that in the classroom, what that might look like?
You bet. And I love how you explained that it's not our role to figure out who has experienced trauma and who hasn't, but rather to approach everyone as if they have, because trauma informed and sensitive practices are really good for all of us. But to better understand really what the effects are like, we can talk a little bit about how trauma can affect folks. So Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist and researcher who has done a lot of work around trauma, has a quote that goes like this: trauma often comes back as a reaction, not a memory. So when you're talking about stories and how we interact with one another's stories, we absolutely do. And we have to kind of get beyond thinking of that story as a narrative or a memory that we may carry, but more as a pattern of reactions that we carry in our nervous systems that affect us as individuals, but then they affect how we interact with one another in relationship too. So nervous system to nervous system, we're carrying those stories. And those nervous system changes can affect how we respond to things in the moment, particularly if something reminds our nervous system of a past overwhelming stress, then we may have reactions come up in our biology and physiology that lead us to feel as if it's happening again. And sometimes we don't even realize, oh, this is a past thing that has been tapped into and it's coming up. We just re-experience it again. And that can be an experience of bigger emotions or bigger feelings. And when I talk about feelings, I mean emotions, but I also mean the changes in sensations that we might experience in our body, like our heart beating faster, our tummy getting that knotted feeling, or our cheeks getting red, and a whole lot of other things too. But then other folks might have a stress reaction, and instead of getting worked up inside, it actually shuts things down. So they may feel more far away, numb, even withdraw from relationships, and even feel separate from self. All of these things exist on a continuum. So someone can feel that a little bit, they can feel that a lot. It's as if the body can either push on the gas pedal or push on the brake, and then sometimes actually can push on both at the very same time. And
That's
then
a
these
blended.
reactions, that happen physiologically then are also affecting our emotions, our actions, but also how we think, our cognitions, our executive function, and then what we do and the patterns that we engage in relationship too.
In your course, which I mentioned I finished taking this morning, I like how you frame it as energy. Like when you've got a kiddo where you've got the gas pedal, it's your sympathetic nervous system, that's hyperarousal. So you see these are more, you correct me, like as a student, aggression, it can come up as hyperactivity, can't sit still, can't focus, and then everyone's like ADHD, ADHD, and I'm always rule out trauma first because that would look like that. A hyperactive kiddo, that could be the sympathetic, the gas pedal, too much, like lots of energy. And then you talk about not enough energy, which to me is hypoarousal. Like that's that
Yes.
dissociative, shut down, you know, kind of trauma response that we see. But then we can also, at any given point, kind of travel along. It can be in continuum. We're here, now we're down here if we've had too much. And that's where I'm like, everybody learn polyvagal theory. We talk so much about this. We won't get into much, but I think that's an easy frame for teachers and educators and parents even, is sometimes too much energy. We get ramped up and then we eventually have to come back down. And then it's just like, no, like depression to me hides here too. Cutting hides here. Kids checking out hides here. Anything else you would add to that? Like there's the depressed, checked out kids and the hyperactive or aggressive, erratic kids.
Yes.
I think perfectionism, like you're
I was just going to say, and then we have kids who don't look like they have either one of those patterns because it's all happening inside, and they look like they're doing well and might be perfectionistic and have this kind of set of beliefs that, well, if I just do everything right and follow all the rules and never get in trouble, nothing bad will happen. And in schools, educators can sometimes even encourage that pattern by saying things like, oh, I love how you follow the rules, or I love how you never get in trouble. And really what that says to the kid is just, please keep doing what you're doing, which is from a high anxiety state inside. So the energy inside is big, even though we don't see the effects in the way we might expect on the outside.
Absolutely. That was me as a kid. I have really high ACE score, right? And none of my teachers knew what was going on at home, but I was a straight A student, super hyper vigilant to achieving and pleasing and, like a lot of that appeasement behavior. We call that now a fawn response. I had a very high fawn response. And no teacher would have ever guessed what was going on in my home. You would never know because like I'd show up, I'm always, doing the assignments. And so I think that is one that teachers miss. I mean, some kids are perfectionists just because they're anxious kids by nature, a little type A, but that can be a trauma response, I think is what you're saying.
Yes, and I'm so sorry that you experienced that as a kid, but I understand how you carried it in that way, and that's how you were best trying to cope with what you were dealing with, and it probably gave you some advantages along the way too in terms of your learning and your
Post-traumatic
relationship.
growth. Yeah, and so this is for educators to know. I just really want to, and I know Jen talks about this so much in her book, so read her book, is because of that. And then I had growth because teachers were my safe place. Like they were the ones doing all the work my parents at that point couldn't do. They loved me, but they couldn't do at the moment, in that moment. And then the teachers, while maybe encouraging the perfectionism, were the ones creating the consistency and predictability and structure that I needed for post-traumatic growth. So teachers can be huge in that process. It was a very big protective factor for me with why I think I turned out okay. Lots of therapy, but okay was I had teachers there the whole time to provide stability.
And in everything you're describing, you're not talking about the teacher as being your therapist,
Oh my God.
necessarily unloading to them what was going on, but rather gave you a place that felt safe, that was structured, that you knew what to expect, where you could put your gifts to use and learn and grow and be creative and be heard and understood. And I think sometimes this narrative, this idea gets put out there that, well, if kids have experienced trauma, they're dysregulated and they can't learn. And I always push back against that because we're all learning every day. And we have many youth and many adults in schools who are learning and teaching effectively, even while they carry big stress. And we're all capable of learning. There are, however, things that we can all do together in community to make that easier and more efficient for both the adults and the learners and their families.
Yeah. So what we can maybe funnel this into, I'm looking at my notes here, into post-traumatic growth. You say in your course that it's when people come together to make meaning out of something, we can transform that adversity into something different. Like how would you talk, maybe this is your jam, post-traumatic growth, how would you describe this and like how we create that kind of environment? And then we can go into your kind of tenets, because I think that's kind of the answer to an extent. Yeah.
I think history is one of those places where we can learn about post-traumatic growth because we can look at difficult things that may happen, whether it's something outside of humans' control, like a disaster, a pandemic perhaps, or things that actually humans engaged in that caused harm, and see how people came through that experience carrying pain, suffering, fear. All of that is very real. The trauma is real from those experiences. And we can look at groups who also took what happened and learned from it. Afterwards, they talk truth about what occurred. In their own time, in their own way, they have felt the feelings even a little bit at a time over time so that they can process through them and then come together in relationship to make change so that we have a better chance of preventing that in the future. I think those are beautiful examples of what post-traumatic growth can look like on a group level, but of course it can happen on an individual level too. Some of the folks who have fought for justice and for change in laws and policies that protect the disabled or protect people who struggle with a particular thing that they've had to go through and then make changes for other people so they have it better. That's a beautiful way to think about what post-traumatic growth can be.
Yeah, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I've always looked at it as a mental health professional that if we look at kids solely as victims, it disables them. And I
Yes.
am really big on being like, when we're healing trauma, is being like, let's find their strengths, let's find their village, let's find their gifts. Like, yes, they need to maybe process what's happened, but even with kids, they don't have the same abilities adults do to process trauma. It's done through play and art, and we kind of go around the periphery anyway. And so
Mhm.
to me, it's just being like, we can't just look at it that way. I think that puts kids at a disadvantage in terms of their healing. And I
Yes.
think, and we also then don't set appropriate boundaries because we feel bad for them. And then they
Yes.
don't have safety because we're not being, we don't have that container. We don't have the limits that they still need to feel that safety from their leaders, from their teachers. So to me, I'm just like, don't, I know they were victimized, but don't look at them as a victim. Look at that post-traumatic growth. Look at their capabilities and where they could go with their life and their strengths too.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate how you were talking about how when we're not in that savior complex, we are coming from a place of believing in them. We will set clearer boundaries. And that's what actually helps them grow. That's where we can
Mhm.
nurture and challenge growth when we have clear boundaries within those relationships and we're honoring them and repairing them when they're harmed. But I even, as you're talking about the strengths, even would go even a little bit further with that
Please.
and saying, look for the strength even in the behavior you're observing that you're even most concerned about. For instance, if I have a kid who is presenting with what gets labeled as oppositional defiant behavior, I hate that label, by the way, but let's say it
I
gets labeled
know.
as that. A kid who pushes back, a kid who wants to do it their way, to be able to see in them, this is somebody who perhaps, not always, but perhaps has had their boundaries violated in some way, or they felt like they were victimized and their power was taken. And their response to that is to say, enough, I don't want this to happen anymore. I'm taking charge. There is power in that. There is healing potential in that. If we honor that and work with them through that, good
Yeah.
things can really come from it.
Yeah, I know. I would you say, and I was just telling some parents, I was doing a consult today, and if teachers, if you have kids who are the ODD, strong-willed kind of kiddos, I really love Ross Green's work on collaborative problem solving with those kids, which then gives them a little bit of I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with Ross Green's work, but
Very
I
much.
like love that model. We've done a podcast with Ross before to talk about this, but I always say like you need to learn that model because there's no point in getting in a power struggle with these kids, and they should be allowed to be strong-willed. To me, as being like, if they're finding their voice and they didn't have a voice, like that's a really good thing, but how do we wield it to work with it, not against it?
Absolutely. Shared power.
Yes, exactly. So in your book, like the original book, you talked about the 4 R's, but then when I was looking at your workbook, we talked about a different kind of four, but I don't know if they were just reframed, like the four kind of tenets: feel safe, be connected, regulated, and learning. I think maybe shorting those: feel safe, be connected, get regulated, and learn. And then you had realize, recognize, respond, and avoid re-traumatization in the other book. I really like the workbook. Like, going through those four tenets are really lovely. I think maybe we can go there because we're talking about, these building the tenets to build these pillars to build the trauma sensitive classroom, right? So
Yes.
let's take a look. Are we good to go with those four?
Let's do it. Let's talk about
All
them. I
right.
think of them as a compass. They're the four, I call them the four essentials of
Mm.
trauma sensitive schools or of building trauma sensitive learning environments. And they're like a compass that can help guide the direction that we go in, and the order matters. So safety is first, because when we are safe and can feel safe, then we're going to be better connected, we're going to be better regulated, and we're going to have a bigger window of tolerance and capacity for learning and growing and all those good things that we want more of to help everyone head towards building resilience. And so safety's first for a reason. And of course, there's going to be things that we do in a preventive way in our environments to set things up so they are safer. Think supervision, think how we're teaching expectations and clear boundaries, and how we're enforcing those or honoring those and repairing harm when it occurs. But there's also lessons that we may teach around safety to help improve that sense of safety for everyone. With that, then we can also think of it in terms of what we're doing responsively. So in any given moment, in any relationship, we may lose some safety and will lose safety from time to time, whether that's because of something that's coming up inside the person that they're activated based on a stressor they're experiencing or that's been tapped into from the past, or we step on each other's toes or the boundary's not honored in the way we need it to be, and we've lost safety in our relationship. And so that needs to be then we need to focus on that first and tend to that, repair that so that we can then move on to a focus on connection. So with each of these essentials, we're thinking of it in a preventive way. We're thinking of it in a curriculum way, but we're thinking of how do we respond in the moment when needs come up that are related to these four essentials too. So it's safety, connection, meaning relationships, healthy relationships, which includes how do we set boundaries? What do we do when they're not honored? What do we do when we try to communicate about that? And we're talking about youth here, and they're not able to figure that out on their own. Who do they go to? What does that process look like? And then how do we as adults support them in working through those breaks in relationships so that that reconnection can occur? And we're
Okay.
also teaching about healthy relationships too.
So can you give me a couple examples, like really concrete? Let's get micro here, of how educators can create that safety in the classroom. What does that look like? What are some of like the really, really like good ones that you would give? Just even just one or two.
For children,
Yeah.
but for all of us as humans, safety comes in relationship. So anytime we are connecting with kids and saying good morning, meeting them on their level, having that compassion in our voice, and we're just saying, I'm so glad you're here. I want to know about you today. Or we remember something from yesterday. You were reading that book. Let's talk about it. Or I can't wait to do science again today because you were so curious yesterday. Or even connecting and having that same sense of care for youth's families and saying, you know what, you told us yesterday mom wasn't feeling well. How's it going today? Is she doing any better? All of that creates that emotional and psychological safety that we all depend on because we're mammals. We're never going to survive on our own. We survive in community together. That's how we're designed. So to think of felt safety in terms of relational safety is really important. But then of course we can link it to things like our expectations that we're not going to hurt each other, and that we're going to learn to solve problems in a way that's safe for everybody too.
Yeah, and I think it's things like understanding kids who come from situations where homes might be volatile, is being careful about shaming language and yelling, like and getting in kids' faces. Like, I think we know this from a cognitive level, but sometimes we have patterns, and that's kind of an old school way of teaching where, like teachers are screaming at kids or in their face or putting them down in front of their peers. But it's worth being said. My,
Absolutely. And that's good for all of us because not even just, oh, I don't want to raise my voice at that kid because I have a wondering of what they've experienced, but it's anybody observing it too, of how activating that could be to a past trauma.
Yeah. And I think teachers too, I'm putting myself back in being a kindergarten teacher for a moment here, is I had a lot of like kids from hard places in my room. I was in an inner city school. And one of the ways I know I carved out safety, because a lot of those kids weren't being loved at home. Let's just be honest, they weren't. There was lots of adversity. Parents were just very distracted or not doing very well. So I always had a poster in my room that said high five, hug, handshake, or none. So when the kids entered my room, they get to choose one of those. And when they exited, but they always had consent, they could choose what level, if any, that they wanted of any physical affection to ground them coming in and ground them going out, but always consent. Like, and there was an option of none. Like, I don't want to touch at all. But I mean, you wouldn't do that with a seventh grader. But if you're working with littles, I found that was always such a nice one to have for the
Absolutely.
littles when they came in.
Yes. Yes. And it's that daily practice of your boundaries matter to me in this relationship that promotes safety.
Okay, so what about be connected? So
It's all
you
about
talk about school
relationships.
climate, hey? Like,
Yeah, yeah. All about relationships and knowing each other. Like to be connected, we
mm,
have to know each other and know each other as human to human. What are your quirks? What are you interested in? What gets on your nerves? What bugs you? What feeds you? What drains you? And we create experiences together where we're sharing joy. That's really where attachment comes from. Healthy connections come from shared joy. And so, how are we doing that together in spontaneous ways, but also ensuring that in our learning environments that we're promoting fun, like we're thinking about that in terms of it's good for our nervous systems, and good for our relationships.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of school climate. I know we spoke with Jessica Joelle Alexander, who talks about how the Danish do this in and keep bullying down. They have very low incidences of bullying in their schools. And they talk a lot about, instead of like it's collective, it's about we as a school and we as a classroom, and not like you do this, you have to follow the rules. It's creating that safety within that it's a community that we're in, not
Yes.
of like where you show up and you have to, do X, Y, and Z, and it feels very individualistic. So how would you say like that we create that climate that of a we culture? Because I feel like that's when kids tend to do better, because if they have that sense of community. How do we like make
Absolutely.
kids feel like they're part of a community better, do you think, in schools?
Yes, I think my favorite way to encourage folks to kind of begin that process is when setting up your expectations and agreements for the new school year is to put up the words being safe and feeling safe help us learn and grow. Being safe and feeling safe help us learn and grow. And then just making a list of what are things that might in the classroom lead us as a group to potentially feel or be unsafe. And then
Mm-hmm.
what are the kinds of actions that help us be safe and feel safe too? And that list, that second list becomes how we create agreements together around how we want this community to operate because it's ours. And so we create it together. And then when those, sorry for the beeping, there's a truck over there outside.
Okay.
Real life, it's just how it happens,
Real
right?
life. Yep.
But then when those boundaries aren't honored, then it's about how do we work through that together as a community, and not to banish someone from the community, not to shame them, but to say, hey, we've got to have some repair here. We want you part of this group. You being here matters. How are we going to work through this together so that we can stay connected or reconnect because there was a break that occurred?
Okay. And then the third tenant is regulated. And I always think like it's a big, self-regulation. Self-regulation is a big phrase right now. We've known it in the psychology community for a long time. Frick, a lot of these kids can't. The problem is they can't self-regulate. That's, one of the issues with the traumatized brain. They need co-regulation,
Yes.
and when
We
we've
have a
got
lot of
that,
educators right now who are struggling to regulate too. It's not
right?
just kids.
It's not just kids. So, I mean, that doesn't help when we have adults who aren't regulated, because then it's like the blind leading the blind, and kids are taking their nervous system response from ours. But what do you think we need to do to promote regulation in the classroom?
One of the first things I encourage educators to do, but family members can do this too, is anytime we want to label a behavior that we're noticing as disobedient,
Mhm.
or often we think of that with younger children, or disrespectful, maybe how we label it with older kids. Anytime we want to do that, to challenge ourselves to change it to the word dysregulated instead. So instead of, oh, they're so disobedient or they're so disrespectful, they're dysregulated.
Mm.
That takes us to what might be driving and likely is driving, at least to some degree, that action that we're seeing. And then once we understand that dysregulation is driving it, there's changes in the nervous system that are kind of propelling things in that direction, then we can tend to the needs that go with the nervous system response. And that will not just clear up the behavior, that's not necessarily our goal, but it will help them be better regulated, which is healthier for all of us. Because the more we can spend of our waking hours in a regulated state within our window of intolerance or window of tolerance, knowing that our energy is going to still go up and down and it's going to change in response to our experiences, the healthier we will be because that conserves energy.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're expending big amounts of energy to go outside of that zone.
Yeah. To me, I always look at it, if I was back in a classroom and I like the energy idea. Some kids are like up here and some are like way down here. So no kids necessarily, they kind of fall into categories, and some are in a blended state. But I always think there should be a mixture of ways to bring energy down in your classroom. So this is where I wish every school had a sensory room, a calm down room. I'm not talking about an isolation chamber here. I'm talking about a room that has low lighting and some sensory activities to kind of like bring them down to like a baseline, or a quiet place they can go to read a book or put noise canceling headphones on, like kids who need to come down. And then there's times where we need to get them back in their bodies because they're dissociative. And that's where I think movement breaks and yoga. I think every teacher should learn some yoga in the classroom, breath work, anything somatic, getting outside, moving their bodies, not taking away recess. Like that is part of like, we can't if the body isn't ready, like it's dysregulated, we can't learn, right?
Right. At
The
least it's
lower
hard.
parts of the brain.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It takes more energy. It's harder. It's not going to work as well. And we can build these regulatory experiences in throughout the day so that we're not just waiting for dysregulation to happen and then we're responding to it. Of
Mhm.
course, we're going to do that. We're going to need to do that. But we can also prevent dysregulation by building in these activities and providing choice throughout how we do this so that kids are learning when I feel like this is what tends to work for me. I'll make this choice instead of thinking about as the teacher has to figure it out and direct everybody about what to do, but that we're teaching kids to listen to their own bodies and make decisions for themselves. That's really the beauty of regulation. It's an inside job.
Beautiful. And I always say it starts with that relationship with that educator
Yeah,
first. Like we can't take kids to a state of regulation unless there's attachment as the precursor. Like
right.
that kid has to feel like you like them or nothing else works. Like
Yeah.
nothing. Like I'm like, you're done. Like you've got to find something you like about this kid.
Hmm.
They have to feel that. And then you can, work on regulation. You can work on learning. But until that point, like it's pretty hard to do
Yeah.
that.
And they've got to feel and experience that you're on their side, that you're not against them, even if you don't like some action that's happening, and that's okay to not like it. Because as adults, we don't have to be calm all the time. We can ride the energy changes of our own nervous system and feel our feelings. We do need to be regulated. We need to not be out of control or taking it out on kids in whatever way that might look for different folks. But we can still be on that kid's side and say, hey, I'm here for you. And sometimes that's as simple as, let's just slow this down. Let's just take a minute. You're stirred up. I'm stirred up, but I'm still for you. So let's just slow it down so that
Mhm.
we can tend to how we feel first. And then you and I will deal with the problem in a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm here. It's just putting the human first, right? Like
Yeah.
their humanity comes first. The learning to me is almost has to be secondary. And
Mhm.
that we may spend, I always tell teachers this, you may spend that whole year just teaching that child about healthy relationships. They may not be ready to learn anything that year, but because you're the adult who showed up for them and spent that whole year getting them to learn it's okay, adults can be trusted and I'm loved and respected, when you hand them off to the teacher the next year in the next grade, they'll be ready to learn then. They'll be ready for academics because we've healed that part of the brain that was very, very, damaged. They didn't trust. They didn't know how to lean into relationship. And to me, you've set them up for the rest of their life then. But we just spend so much time focused on academic outcomes and test scores that we realize like if the brain can't trust and can't love and can't lean into connection vulnerability, it won't learn. It's not in the right state. So
I
that's why
do
it
want
comes.
I do want educators though not to set those academics off to the side
Oh, no,
because
no,
because that does happen sometimes. People say,
no.
"Oh, they've been through so much. Let's not put those expectations out there. Let's not push them." I think we can do both. I really think we can do both. That we can say, "I'm here for you. I'm going to create safety for you and with you. We're going to put the relationships first. I'm going to center your regulatory needs and I'm going to nurture and challenge your growth because I care way too much about you to
Mm-hmm.
not help you grow as a reader and a writer and a mathematician and a science thinker and a social studies thinker this year because we need you in this world making a difference like we need
Mm-hmm.
every kid making a difference." I
That's
think we
good.
can hold both of those at the same time.
Otherwise, yeah, maybe it goes down towards the whole like victim piece that we
It
don't
does.
still have those limits, boundaries, and those expectations then.
And there's some research showing that there are many positive outcomes that come from trauma-informed professional development for educators, especially as it relates to behavioral improvement, improved regulation, sense of belonging and community. And there are academic gains and attendance gains that come with it too. But there are some vulnerabilities that we have to pay attention to in the research, and that is that savior complex and that tendency that some teachers may have to lower expectations, and that harms kids too. So
Mm.
we can't do that.
Yeah. And I guess that fourth tenet kind of comes into play once the other three tenets have been honored. So when kids
Yes.
feel safe, they feel connected, they're regulated, then that upstairs brain is ready to do its job. And that's the idea. And I always say like the brain knows what to do given the
Mhm.
right environment. It will naturally move towards a place of healing, neuroplasticity, if we set the right conditions for the healing to happen, which is always about physical safety, that brain stem, rhythm, predictability, and then your limbic system, which is all about attachment, relationship, empathy, those compassion, those pieces, then that upstairs brain is free to do the cool things like math and social and complex problem solving and all of those pieces. And was that like
Yes,
kind of like the idea of that fourth tenet, especially for you?
absolutely. That we're creating the conditions that foster learning so that we there as quickly as we can and push kids, nurture and challenge that growth. Now that's not to say that if we provide those conditions that everybody will have all they need to learn. We know that we have neurodiversity in all people, in our nervous systems too, but also in terms of our learning needs. And we also know that trauma can play a role in disabilities. That's not to say that everybody who's experienced trauma has a disability. It's not to say that all disabilities are caused by trauma either. But we do know that there are some youth who've experienced severe traumatization, especially in their earliest years, and that has played a
Right.
role in some of the disabilities they have, particularly in that upstairs brain in terms of how it functions with attention, memory, language processing, understanding cause and effect, other executive functions that can really get in the way of folks learning if we don't understand the needs that they may have around that. I was in a classroom. I'm doing some observations earlier this week, and of course I'll change some pieces of what I saw here to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. But there was a student who was being understood, and this happens in schools all across the world, where the student is not doing the work, and even when they're better regulated, the work isn't getting done. And so I engaged with this educator, and like I do with so many others, to talk about, what do you think is getting in the way of getting started? And often we're taught as educators, it's well, maybe they just want attention, or maybe they just want out of the work, or there's something else that they want that's more preferred to that. And I encourage folks to go deeper. Why might they not be getting started? Is it because they can't remember what the first step is, or they see the whole thing that they're supposed to be doing and they're overwhelmed, and then the regulation that they had is gone? Is it that they don't have that skill yet? And once we can narrow it down to what's getting in the way of getting started, then we can provide supports around that that will also promote better regulation, because they won't be overwhelmed by the stressor of the academic task.
Yeah, which it kind of comes down to what part of this problem is hard. Like what part of this? Because often it is something as simple as like I just can't remember to start, or I can do, I know how to read X amount of words, but without some pictures and guidance, I have a hard time, making sense, like getting the context of it, the comprehension. But just asking them. And they might not know. We have to maybe do some problem solving, but I doubt it's the whole thing. It's
Yeah, yeah.
and giving them some credit. They have still some strengths. There's something about this they probably can do, but figuring out where the crutch is, but still being able to say to them, but this part is good. You got this part. We just have to fix this part.
Yeah. And as you mentioned Ross Green, and one of the things he says is,
Mm,
seldom is the reason, I just don't wanna. Like that's seldom the reason. We think that's the reason, but that doesn't mean our guess is correct.
yeah. Like I have yet to meet a child that doesn't want to feel success, that doesn't want to feel love. Like
Yeah.
they want to be successful. They don't want to fail. Like no
Yeah.
kid wants to fail. They just might be in a state of learned helplessness, or they feel like nothing works, so why try? And to me,
Yeah.
that's the kid, is being like, I've done this, I've tried, it doesn't work, so it's just easier not to care
Yeah.
because I haven't had any success so far. And it hurts too much to keep feeling this failure. So I just would rather armor up and say I don't care. But truly, kids they want to feel seen, they want to feel successful, they want to do
Well, I
well.
think that's true of adults too. I
Yeah.
mean, I work with parents, I work with other family caregivers, I work with educators day in and day out, and we see these responses in adults sometimes where they're giving up. Maybe they're too overwhelmed to try something new, but even if they're better regulated and we're experiencing reluctance, is it that? Is it that they're afraid to try? They're afraid to risk again. They don't have the skills yet to be successful, and it just feels safer to not try. Because
Yeah.
if once we understand that, we can work through that together.
One of the things that comes up probably like I mean, you work with teachers all the time, so maybe there's a few we can talk about, the questions that come up. And in your course, I love it. You have teachers asking questions and that come up a lot. I was looking at all of them. I'm like, yes, these are things like teachers want to know. So go to the course. She answers all of them. But this one comes up for me a lot. And it comes up for me when I used to work as a substitute teacher in some behavior classrooms. And we have kids throwing desks. We have kids who have very violent kind of temper tantrums and dysregulation, and they get very physical. And you've got, every teacher says this, I've got 20 some other kids in that classroom. How do I honor the fact I know this kid's had a tough life? How do I honor their trauma here and everything they're going through, but also keep the rest of my kids safe? Because I can't put all of their needs below his or hers. So, like, I'm sure you hear this, but like that's probably one of the biggest ones I hear. So, like, how would you respond to that?
Yes, I hear it every day, and it's an important question. It's a valid question. So
Mhm.
my first response to that is always, I understand why you're wrestling with that. You care about the student who has big dysregulation, maybe has gone through some really hard stuff, and maybe still is. You care about them and want their needs to be met, and you care about the safety and well-being and learning needs of all of your students. We're required to hold both. That's our
Mm.
responsibility to do that as
It's so
educators.
hard to
So
hold both.
so hard to hold both. So hard to hold both. And then we have to throw in our needs as adults in these communities too. No wonder it's messy. It's messy. I really encourage folks to think of this in a couple of different ways. So we're going to create a plan around the needs of that student who is having that big threatening behavior. Because if what we're seeing is big behavior and repair, and then we just start it all over again and again and again, chances are we haven't structured things up enough. We haven't supported them enough. We're not in the work deep enough yet where we're preventing those episodes. And so that's one whole set of the work. But I understand you're asking about the other side of the work too. And that is, what do we do after it happens to support all the needs of the other students? So at the same time, we're thinking about how to meet that individual learner's needs. We have to be prepared to address the needs of the whole group that are going to come up. And I like to think of this in 4 steps, is what I encourage educators to do. And the first is, when there's an episode like that in your classroom community, we go back to those 4 essentials. First, you're going to pay attention to safety. All right. So
Yeah.
you're going to attend to the safety needs. You're going to lean into your protocols and steps that your district, your board, your school has in place to get everything safer. And then once it's safer, we're going to focus on connection and regulation before we focus on learning. So that to me often looks like saying to kids, that was a lot. That came on fast. I have some kind of stirred up feelings or shut down feelings in my own body. You may too. Let's circle up a minute. We're going to acknowledge what happened by saying that was a lot. We're
Mhm.
going to put ourselves in a role of a nurturing protector, a wise leader who knows what to do. So you can say to kids, we've got some folks helping that student. I'm going to help you, and I know how to help you right now. Your confidence, your wisdom, your regulation in these moments is key, because that's where children will experience that felt safety. You're their leader. They can look to you to help take care of them in this moment. And so one way to do that is to acknowledge feelings and needs. Invite everybody to share one feeling and one need they have. They can tell it to a partner. You can do a round robin around the circle and share. You can have everybody put one on a sticky note and show it to somebody if they want to, or not if they don't want to. And you can model that for them as well, saying, you know what, I feel a little stirred up inside. I need a moment to let it settle, or I need to let some of that out, whatever that might be. And you let them share what they feel and what they need if they'd like. And sometimes we don't know what we need. And so you can even say to kids, it's okay to say, I'm not sure what I need, or I need help knowing what I need, or I need time to think about what I need. And from there, we can do a transition then back into whatever's next. And we can do that in a regulating way. So I like to encourage folks at this point to use trauma sensitive movement. You mentioned yoga earlier. We know that yoga can be regulating. And I wrote a quick guide with Tracy Ludwig about trauma sensitive movement for the classroom, which brings in more choice than typical yoga usually does, so that it could be trauma informed in nature, meaning people are listening to their own bodies and making
Yeah.
decisions in these simple movements that are gentle to help them. And so you can
What-
use one of those strategies in that moment to transition from that classroom discussion about feelings and needs right into what's next, because we know that rhythm and routine for kids is so important in helping them feel safe too. We don't want to sit and talk about those feelings for 2 hours and move into a
No,
type
because
of
that's a therapy
that's
session,
not
and
the
I'm
point.
always, I think it's just the kids feeling seen in their feelings, just saying like, and the teacher's
Yes.
job isn't to fix it. It's parents too. I'm
Thank
like,
you.
you don't have to fix it. The kids are just saying, see this, like, just see that this is hard. And you're saying, I can handle your feelings about the situation and I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. That's like the key to parenting too. I was like,
It is.
"Just
It's so, and
fix."
it's so hard for us as
I
adults
know
to
we
do
want to
that.
fix it.
We
Teachers
want to
definitely want to
fix
fix it.
it.
Yeah. They're
I was
doers.
working
They're
like a
planners.
kindergarten teacher a couple years ago. We were in the school and she was working on the skill of, Dan Siegel's Name It to Tame It, just sitting with the kid with their feelings, mirroring it. And she was practicing it with me and she went back into the classroom, came back a couple hours later. She goes, "This stuff works. I can't believe it. This kindergartner came in from recess. He's somebody who tends to get dysregulated, has some big behavior. He felt like something was unfair at recess. I said, it seems like you think that was unfair." And he just looked at me and he said, "Thank you." And then I said, "Do you need anything else?" And he said, "No, I really don't." And they
Yeah.
both had this moment of, I just needed to be seen. He
Just
just
need to
needed
be
to be
seen.
seen.
I know. Like, I just think my son and daughter had a big blowout the other night. And doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Like they're blowing up for reasons that had nothing to do with that particular moment anyway. Usually it has nothing to do with the moment. Something had happened earlier that day. And just sitting there and just being like, it's really hard when your sister, hits you. I think she hit him. She hit you, and just hard. It's hard when you don't feel loved there. And then, like, that's it. There's no, like, fixing. There's no, like, at that moment, there's no repairing. Like, they're both worked up, but just, like, sitting there and just being like, yeah. And sometimes even those kids, I think we have to do that repair with the kid who did blow up in the room and that teacher making sure they make that repair with that kid and being able to say that was a really hard moment. I just want to sit here. Is it okay if I sit here with you for a second? Like, we really miss you in the classroom. Like, and just being able to, like, not fix it, not talk about you should have made a different choice and lecturing. It's like, kid knows it was embarrassing for him or her. It's embarrassing to lose it like that in front of all of your peers. They know it wasn't okay. And just being able to say this is really hard.
Yeah.
I'm,
And
I'm
I
still
think
here.
it's key for the kid, obviously. I mean, that's who we're focused on as we're thinking about this, but it's also
Yeah.
helpful to the educator because I think and this is true for parents too, we put so much pressure on ourselves to figure it out, to do the work, to come up with
Yeah.
a plan, to teach it, all the things. There's a little bit of relief in just being able to say to a kid, "This is a really hard moment, isn't it?"
Stop talking.
And just be
Stop
there
talking.
together. Talking. That's why I do this.
Just
Just
be
like,
there.
shh,
Just
hold on.
sit.
Just sit
Just
there with
sitting.
them.
Just sitting with
But
them and just
to
and I
actually imagine that responsibility of fixing it, like washing away or being taken off your shoulders. I think that's big for the stress that educators and family caregivers are carrying too.
Yeah, I think teachers think with all this talk of mental health, they're expected to be therapists. And I love that you kept highlighting in your course, that's not your job. That's
Mhm.
not your job. We're not asking you to process trauma or investigate the trauma. It is not your job to go into this, take trauma therapy and do this in your class. That isn't your job. Your job is to hold their story, meaning like because they're recreating their story in your classrooms. You're holding that. And really, by just giving them what you're talking about is safety and connection and really co-regulation. When you say regulation, I'm like, first it's co-regulation, then they learn to regulate. Honestly, you've already given them a different ending to their story. Like, that's the thing I think
Right.
teachers don't get is being like, they felt disconnection often at home. They felt unseen, unheard, unloved. And when you can just give them that in the class, you've created a new ending to their narrative. Like,
Mhm.
how amazing is that? I was like, you have so much power, but that just means you're showing up and you're
Yeah.
being predictable and you're being loving and firm. At this, you talk about in your course about how to set boundaries, which is why we don't have a lot of time to go into it. But I'm like, take the course, you'll learn how to set boundaries more effectively with kids because they need that. But I always think like you're giving them the new ending. You don't need to know the story, but you will. Any kid who's had trauma has the experience of not being understood, not loved, not safe, not heard, not seen.
Right. And I think we think of it as anytime we can help each other and our nervous systems get back within that just right zone, that window of tolerance, that we're all
Mhm.
going to experience stress in this world. These systems that we're operating in are harming us all. And if some of us, because of the group that we're in, thinking of myself as a white woman, middle
Mhm.
class, if I'm not experiencing some of the stressors some of my fellow humans are, the way these systems are going, at least in the US at the moment, and they're getting worse and worse, they're coming for us all. And so we're all going to experience this stress. But the more we can create these like safe places on the game springboard for one another in whatever environments we're in, where we help each other experience regulation and relationship. That's good for our nervous systems, even if it's simply giving us a break from the system of harm that we're encountering, because it's all around us.
Yeah. I do have to, before we end this, can you just, this one boundary one, I want you just to really quickly, if we have like 2 minutes, is this yes if. When you talk about boundaries, because I mentioned boundaries, I want to give them one sample of your course, like for boundaries, because I think these kids need containment. They need expectations. They need someone to say, this is a hard limit I'm setting. It's not a door, it's a wall. This is not, this is not okay. You can still be compassionate in that moment. So you say yes if. What would you just explain yes if?
Well, we often think of a boundary as a wall, as a no. And sometimes it needs to be. Sometimes it needs to be, and I'm done. But what often happens is we don't set the smaller boundaries along the way, and then we become so dysregulated and so overwhelmed by what's occurring that we then shut the relationship out entirely. And sometimes that's absolutely what's needed when we're talking about abuse in a relationship, injustice, then we need that no if it's safe for us to do that.
Okay.
And sometimes it's not too. But we can also think of those smaller boundaries along the way as ways to keep saying yes to the relationship if we want to, but yes if. Like, I can say yes to this job if this part of it is not so overwhelming. Or I can say yes to meeting this kid's needs if I have support with this piece of it, because I don't have that myself yet. That yes if can help us stay connected, stay engaged, keep the relationship a yes when we want it to be, if we can think about what are the conditions that would help me to be my best within it.
Do you use yes if with students directly? Because like I would,
Absolutely.
Yeah, like it's like my kids wanting, I don't know, like TV or something. But they have some chores they need to do first. Like, I'm just thinking of something really benign. And I'm like, well, absolutely, yes. Like, we can go have a family movie. So, and we'll have these if you scroll down. If you're in our summit, it'll be below this video. You will see links to her book, like the course with the workbook and then the book. So, Building Trauma Sensitive Schools is the first book that I bought. What year did you put that out? I was trying to remember the first time I read this book. And I was like,
2019, I think.
oh, so good. Right before COVID. And then this is the follow-up, which it came with a course. And I was like, yes, that's brilliant. So you can do. Now, Jen also is for hire to work with schools. So I'll have to get that link to we'll put your website on there. So principals, administrators can get a hold of you to do a training for their team, which I highly, highly would recommend if they're going to teach this model in schools, like it's taught in schools, honestly. So we'll give all the resources. Is there anything else I'm missing? There's the course, the workbook. You do training.
I'm going to send you the link to the quick guide so you can see that trauma sensitive movement quick guide, because I think you would like it too.
Oh, yeah, yes, please. So we can give that as a resource as well. Thank you. Thank you for doing this for our audience, for our podcast, for our summit. Teachers, I know, are really struggling right now. And they want to be there for these students. They want to be trauma informed, but they're just not really sure, I think, their role and what's helpful for these kids, and not crossing the boundaries into being a therapist, because that's not their job and we don't want them to be. It's too much. You've got enough on your plate with these tools that Jen is giving you. That is enough. Like, these are enough. You can stop there and make referrals to other professionals after that. Absolutely. And what I love about your work is it's not asking them to learn like 100 different emotion regulation strategies. It's a framework for being supportive and inclusive. And just knowing trauma goes on in these classes. We've got, like you said in your book, 35 million children. That's 50% of kids will experience some form of trauma. That was a 2016 stat. I don't even know what it would be now.
I'm sure it's higher.
Yeah. I'm sure it's higher. If we want to include COVID, all of us, yay. But yes, so thank you for being a thought leader in this area and providing some sound reasoning and a framework that I think is manageable for teachers. I really do. And they need to feel like it's manageable to be able to put it into action.
Yes. Well, thank you for your feedback. Thank you for having me. I always love connecting with you and talking with you. And I would love to support folks in whatever way that looks like for them. I have free resources on my website. They can follow along online. And for anyone who's interested in more, I'm here for that too. So thanks so much for having me. And I hope everyone takes good care.
Thanks.